The wind howled through the crowded streets of New York City, a biting chill slicing through even the thickest winter coats. Ethan Carver sat in the back of his chauffeured car, absently scrolling through his phone as the city lights blurred past the tinted windows. The gala he had just left had been as he expected, glittering, hollow, and filled with people whose smiles didn't quite reach their eyes. For someone like Ethan, whose every step in life was calculated, nights like these were routine. Yet they left him feeling even more detached from the world around him. As the car slowed at a red light, Ethan's gaze shifted to the sidewalk. His driver cleared his throat, ready to point out a delay ahead, but Ethan's hand stopped him mid-sentence. Something on the corner had caught Ethan's attention. A little girl sat huddled on the ground, clutching a torn piece of cardboard with shaky hands. Her coat, if it could be called that, was more patches than fabric, and her thin legs were bare despite the freezing wind. Written in scrawled letters on the cardboard were the words, "Help me save my sister." For a moment, Ethan thought he might be imagining it. The girl, no older than 7, looked up, her sunken eyes meeting his through the window. She wasn't begging or waving. She was just sitting there, staring into the void, a quiet resignation written across her pale face. "Stop the car," Ethan said abruptly. "Sir?" the driver asked, confused. "I said stop the car." The driver hesitated before easing the vehicle to the curb. Ethan stepped out, the bitter cold instantly biting at his skin. He regretted not grabbing his coat from the back seat, but walked toward the girl anyway. The closer he got, the more fragile she looked, her small frame dwarfed by the towering buildings around her. "Hey there," Ethan said, crouching to her level. He wasn't sure why he was doing this. He could have easily called a social worker or donated to some charity, but something about her pulled at a part of him he thought had been buried long ago. The girl looked up, her lips trembling as she clutched the cardboard tighter. She didn't say anything. "You're out here all alone?" Ethan asked, his voice softer than usual. "Where's your family?" The girl's voice, when it came, was barely audible. "My sister. She's missing. I can't find her." Ethan frowned, glancing around. The bustling city moved on without noticing her, people rushing past without a second glance. He dug into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. "Here," he said, holding out a few bills. "Get yourself something warm to eat." The girl didn't take the money. Instead, she shook her head, her tangled hair falling into her eyes. "I don't want your money." Ethan blinked, caught off guard. "Then what do you want?" She hesitated, as if unsure whether she should say it. Finally, she looked up, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Take me somewhere safe," she whispered, "and find my sister." The words hit Ethan like a blow. He stared at her, the cold wind numbing his hands, though it was the weight of her plea that truly froze him in place. She wasn't begging for food or money. She was asking for something far more difficult. And yet, there was something in her voice, in her eyes, that made it impossible for him to turn away. "All right," he said finally, standing up and motioning for her to follow. "Let's get you inside first. We'll figure out the rest." The girl hesitated for a moment before reaching out her small, trembling hand. Ethan took it, the fragility of her touch sending a strange pang through his chest. He led her to the car, ignoring the questioning look from his driver as he opened the door and helped her in. "What's your name?" Ethan asked once they were seated, the warmth of the car thawing the chill from their bodies. "Lily," she replied softly. Ethan nodded. "All right, Lily. Let's start with something warm to eat, and then we'll see what we can do about finding your sister." Lily's eyes widened slightly, as if she hadn't expected him to actually listen. She nodded, pulling her knees to her chest and watching him closely, as though trying to figure out if he could really be trusted. The car rolled forward, and Ethan found himself staring out the window, his thoughts racing. He had no idea why he was doing this. He was a businessman, not a savior, and his life was built on careful plans and calculated risks. Helping a street child? That wasn't part of the equation. But as he glanced at Lily again, her tiny frame curled up in the corner of the seat, he felt something he hadn't in years, the faint stirrings of a conscience. He didn't know how, but he was going to help her. And maybe, just maybe, in helping her, He'd find a way to silence the ghosts that had haunted him for so long. Ethan instructed the driver to take them somewhere they could get a hot meal. His initial thought had been to drop Lily off at a shelter, but the way she looked at him, wary yet hopeful, made it impossible to abandon her so quickly. He glanced at her as they rode through the quiet streets, noticing the small, nervous movements of her hands. The car's gentle hum and the distant city lights cast reflections on the windows, and for a brief moment he imagined himself as someone different, someone whose life had taken a kinder path. He almost smiled at the absurdity of it. For years he had avoided entanglements of any kind. Now, all it took was one look into a child's frightened eyes to make him question who he had become. They stopped at a small diner that was still open late. Ethan ushered Lily inside, watching as she cast anxious glances around. A waitress approached, leading them to a booth near the window. Ethan shrugged off his expensive overcoat and draped it over the seat beside Lily to help warm her. He noticed how she pressed herself into the corner, as if trying to make herself smaller, her eyes darting between him and the door. He wondered how many people had offered her empty promises before. He cleared his throat and attempted a gentle tone. "You can order whatever you like. Maybe some soup, something warm," he said quietly. Lily nodded, not quite looking at him, her fingers fiddling with the edge of the menu. Ethan tried to recall the last time he'd actually sat down with a child for a meal. He'd been an uncle once, or so he'd hoped to be long ago. But that was a time he never allowed himself to think about. Yet tonight, the past tapped insistently at his mind. When the waitress returned, Lily asked for chicken noodle soup and a slice of bread. Ethan felt a twinge of sadness, realizing that for someone in her position that might seem like a feast. He ordered a coffee for himself and some pancakes, hoping to tempt her with something a bit more comforting. As they waited, he leaned forward slightly, trying to make his voice as soft as possible. "Lily," he said, and her eyes slowly met his. "Where have you been staying? Do you have any place to go?" He expected her to clam up, but after a pause, she shrugged. "Sometimes shelters," she said quietly, "but they're full a lot. Sometimes it's just the street." She averted her gaze, embarrassed, perhaps, by the truth of her situation. Ethan nodded slowly, choosing his words carefully. "And your sister? How old is she?" Lily swallowed, her thin shoulders rising and falling. "She's 5. We were together until last week. We were hungry. I told her to stay put while I looked for food, but when I came back she was gone." Ethan felt an unexpected surge of protective anger. A child of 5, missing and alone in a city like this. He clenched his jaw, trying to keep his voice calm. "We'll find her," he said, his tone steady. Lily's gaze flicked to him, searching for any hint of a lie. Finding none, she nodded, though her eyes remained filled with worry. The soup arrived, steam rising from the bowl. Lily sipped it slowly at first, then faster as if the warmth might melt away the gnawing cold inside her. Ethan watched her, remembering how he had grown up in comfort, never worrying about his next meal. Guilt, an old unwelcome friend, began to settle in his chest. He pushed it aside and forced a gentle smile when Lily looked at him again. "After we eat, we'll find you someplace safe for the night," he said. "Tomorrow, I'll make some calls. We'll start looking properly." He said it as if it were a business plan. Identify the problem, apply resources, find a solution. He was good at that. But he knew this wasn't a problem that could be solved with a phone call or a check. It might take time, and for the first time in years, he felt willing to use that time for someone else's sake. Lily didn't answer right away. Instead, she dipped her bread into the broth and took a careful bite. He waited. After a moment, she spoke softly. "Why are you helping me?" Her question was direct and without accusation, but it caught him off guard. He thought about lying, about saying something noble, but the truth was he wasn't sure. There was something in her quiet sadness and the way she refused his money that had made him stop. Something that reminded him of who he might have been a long time ago. He cleared his throat, choosing his words with care. I guess I just want to make sure you're safe," he said. "No one should have to be alone out there." She seemed to consider this, perhaps measuring his sincerity. Then she nodded. He realized that was all the answer she needed for now. They finished their meal in near silence. Outside, the city was quieter, streetlights painting soft halos on the pavement. Ethan paid the bill, thanking the waitress, who cast a concerned glance at Lily but said nothing. He led the girl outside, his hand hovering protectively near her shoulder, not quite touching, letting her keep her space. He guided her back to the car, explaining quietly to the driver that they needed to find a place for her to sleep. The driver raised an eyebrow but said nothing, and soon they were moving again, deeper into the night. Ethan tried a couple of well-regarded shelters first, but they were full, apologetic staff shaking their heads. He considered making a call to a friend who ran a community center, but it was late, and Lily was shivering again despite the car's heat. Finally, he decided on a modest but clean hotel in a safer part of town, one he knew would be discreet and would not question a man arriving with a young girl in need of help. He felt a pang of uncertainty, aware of how all this might look, but he refused to let appearances stop him. Once inside the small, warm hotel room, Lily looked around uncertainly. Ethan handed her one of the blankets from the bed. "You can rest here tonight," he said quietly. "I'll stay right outside in the lobby if that makes you feel safer." He said it gently, knowing trust was earned, not demanded. Lily hesitated, then shook her head. "You can stay," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to be alone." Ethan's heart tightened at that simple admission. He pulled a chair over near the window, leaving space between them so she wouldn't feel crowded. She curled up on the bed, still in her clothes, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. Outside, sirens hummed in the distance, and the city's noise never fully ceased. Ethan watched Lily as she drifted into a fitful sleep. He knew this was just the beginning, that finding her sister would be complicated. But as he sat there, gazing at the worn carpet and the outdated wallpaper, he felt something inside him shift. He had made a promise to this girl, and he intended to keep it. He would do whatever it took to help her, even if it meant confronting parts of his own past he had long tried to bury. He stayed awake until Lily's breathing evened out. Then, as the first hints of dawn pressed against the horizon, he closed his eyes, determined to make good on his word. Ethan awoke to the muffled sounds of footsteps in the hallway and the soft hum of traffic outside. He blinked away the fatigue clinging to him and looked over at the bed. Lily was still asleep, curled into herself as if trying to hold her body together. He checked the time on his phone. It was early morning, barely past sunrise, and a faint gray light seeped through the thin curtains. He could have slipped out quietly, but he knew better than to leave her alone. Instead, he waited until she stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She looked around, momentarily startled, as if forgetting where she was. He offered a gentle smile. "There's a bathroom over there," he said softly. "You can wash up. I'll call down for some breakfast." Lily nodded wordlessly, rubbing sleep from her eyes as she headed to the small bathroom. After the door clicked shut, Ethan picked up the room's phone and ordered oatmeal, toast, and fruit. He wasn't sure what Lily liked, but it seemed safe enough. While waiting, he paced the room, considering his next steps. Finding a missing child in a city so large was daunting. He would need help, more than just a few phone calls. He thought of a man he knew, a private investigator who handled delicate matters discreetly. Maybe he would be willing to take this on. When Lily emerged, her hair still damp from splashing water on her face, Ethan motioned for her to sit down at the small table near the window. She approached slowly, as if unsure of this new arrangement. He noticed that her eyes no longer carried the immediate terror he'd seen before, but caution lingered. "I'm going to try to help you find your sister," he said as calmly as possible. "But I need to know anything you can tell me about her. Her name, what she looks like, where you last saw her. That might help us get started." Lily took a moment before responding. "Her name is Rosie," she said quietly. "She's 5. She's got dark hair like mine, and she's small, even for her age." She paused, biting her lower lip. "We were looking for food near a park. I don't know the name. Just remember there were 2 big lion statues near the entrance." Ethan nodded. That was at least something. He stored the details in his mind, ready to pass them along later. The breakfast arrived, and Lily eyed the bowl of oatmeal, then slowly began to eat. Ethan sipped a cup of coffee, considering how to phrase his next questions. "Do you remember anything unusual that night?" he asked gently. "Anyone watching you too? Or did something happen that made you worried?" Lily looked down at her spoon. "I saw a man near the park," she said after a long silence. "He kept looking at us. I told Rosie to stay put, and I ran across the street where I thought someone threw out some old bread. When I got back, she was gone." Ethan clenched his jaw. This was worse than he feared. Still, he kept his voice steady. "I'm going to call someone who might help. He's a friend, sort of. He finds people, tries to keep them safe. Is that okay?" Lily nodded, her eyes fixed on the steam rising from her oatmeal. Ethan pulled out his phone and stepped to the other side of the room, where he spoke in low tones, explaining the situation to the investigator. His contact was surprised. Ethan was not known for emotional involvement, but eventually agreed to meet them later that day. While Ethan spoke, Lily finished her meal and stared out the window. She saw the busy street below, cars and people moving purposefully, as if the world had not paused for her sorrow. She felt a strange mixture of hope and fear. This man, Ethan, he was doing more than she had expected. But part of her wondered if he'd give up once he realized how hard this would be. It wouldn't be the first time someone turned away when things got difficult. Ethan hung up and approached her. "He'll meet us in a couple of hours," he said. "In the meantime, I can take you to a safe place. There's a community center I know, run by a friend of mine. She's kind, and she helps kids in need." Lily's shoulders tightened. "You're leaving me there?" she asked, her voice small. Ethan shook his head. "I'm not leaving you. I just want you to be comfortable while we figure this out. I'll stay with you if you want." She looked at him, measuring his words. "Yes, please," she said finally, her voice barely audible. They checked out of the hotel, and Ethan made sure to keep Lily close as they navigated the morning crowds. He hailed a taxi and gave the driver an address in a quieter neighborhood. Outside the community center, the smell of fresh bread drifted from a nearby bakery, and a group of children played hopscotch on the sidewalk. It was a small building with bright murals painted on the walls. Inside, a woman with kind eyes and silver hair greeted them. Her name was Marjorie, and Ethan had once donated to her cause, though he'd never bothered to truly understand her mission. Now he regretted that distance and introduced Lily with genuine respect. Marjorie knelt down to Lily's height. "Hello, dear," she said gently. "You're safe here. Would you like to sit with some of the other children while Ethan talks with me?" Lily hesitated. Ethan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, not pushing, just letting her know it was okay. Finally, Lily nodded and followed a volunteer to a room filled with blankets, books, and soft toys. Ethan watched her go before turning to Marjorie. He explained the situation in detail. Marjorie listened quietly, her lips pressed together in sympathy. "We'll keep her safe here," she said, "and we'll help in any way we can. You're doing a good thing." Ethan looked around at the brightly painted room, at the children who were smiling and talking, and he wondered if Lily might feel just a bit of relief in this space. It would give him time to meet the investigator and strategize. He spent the next hour making calls, arranging a time and place to meet his contact. As he paced near the entrance, he caught glimpses of Lily in the playroom. She sat quietly at first, clutching her hands tightly, but after a while, a small boy offered her a crayon, and she began to draw. The sight made Ethan's heart ache. He remembered the last time he had seen a child in his family draw something. His mind drifted, unbidden, to memories he had long suppressed. This was no time for that, he told himself. He had a job to do, a promise to keep. When it was time, Ethan told Marjorie he'd return soon and asked her to watch over Lily. "Don't worry, we'll look after her like our own," Marjorie said. Ethan gave her a grateful nod. Before leaving, he stepped into the room where Lily sat. She looked up from her paper, and he could see uncertainty flicker across her face. He knelt beside her, speaking quietly so as not to draw the other children's attention. "I have to go meet someone who can help us find Rosie," he said. "I'll come back. I promise." Lily's grip on the crayon tightened, and after a moment she nodded. "You'll come back," she repeated, as if testing the words. Ethan stood and walked out before she could see the doubt in his eyes. He meant what he said, but he knew better than anyone that this city was full of broken promises. Still, as he stepped into a waiting car, he felt something unfamiliar flicker inside him. It was determination, pure and steady. He intended to find Rosie, and he intended to keep Lily safe, no matter what it took. Ethan climbed into the waiting car, giving the driver an address near the detective's office. He spent the short ride thinking through everything he needed to say. The investigator was a man named Simon, someone he had used in the past to discreetly gather information on business associates or potential acquisitions. This was entirely different. He had to convince Simon to help him track down a missing child with nothing more to go on than a park with lion statues and a suspicious stranger's lingering gaze. Stepping out onto the sidewalk, Ethan ignored the icy gusts that tugged at his collar and approached a small building wedged between a dry cleaner and a boarded-up bakery. Inside, he climbed a flight of stairs that creaked under his weight, reaching a narrow hallway lit by a single dim bulb. At the end of that hall was a door with a frosted pane of glass. He knocked once, firmly. After a few seconds, the door opened to reveal Simon. A lean man with thinning hair, dressed in a rumpled shirt and slacks that might have been fresh a week ago. Simon gave Ethan a curious look, motioning him inside. The office was cramped, its walls covered in old news clippings, maps, and photos pinned haphazardly. A single desk lamp gave off a warm, yellowish glow, and the radiator hissed softly in the corner. Simon gestured to a wooden chair, then sat down behind his desk. "I'm surprised you called," he said, his voice calm but curious. "You usually send an assistant." Ethan cleared his throat and took a seat. "This is personal," he said quietly. He described Lily's situation, how he found her in the street, how her younger sister had vanished near a park with lion statues. He didn't mention why he cared so much. Simon knew better than to ask. When Ethan finished, Simon tapped a pen against the edge of his desk, thinking. "Lion statues," he said. "That could be Riverside Park. There's a pair of lion sculptures near the entrance by the old fountain. It's not exactly a well-guarded area at night." He shuffled through some papers and pulled out a city map. "I'll need to ask around, see if anyone reported anything suspicious. The problem is that children go missing too often here, and too many of them end up in the hands of people who think they can profit from the vulnerable." Ethan stiffened. He had prepared himself for this possibility, but hearing it out loud made his blood run cold. "I want you to do whatever it takes," he said. "I don't care about the cost. Just find her." Simon nodded. There was no need to confirm payment. The look in Ethan's eyes told him this wasn't about money, but he knew Ethan would pay well to ensure results. They worked out a plan. Simon would start by checking with a contact in the neighborhood, someone who watched the streets late at night. He would also try to find security camera footage from nearby shops or traffic cameras. While Simon took notes, Ethan tapped his foot, impatient. He wanted action now, but he understood the need for patience. Lily's sister wouldn't be found through brute force or rush decisions. They needed a careful approach. After leaving Simon's office, Ethan stepped back into the cold afternoon. He paused on the sidewalk, pulling out his phone, tempted to check on Lily at the community center. He pictured her small frame hunched over a piece of paper, drawing quietly while other children played. He wondered if she was worrying about whether he would return. He wondered if she would believe him when he told her he was doing everything possible. The thought weighed on him as he began walking down the block. He decided to head toward the area Simon had mentioned. Even if he lacked the skills to pick up clues, just seeing the place might help him understand. A taxi dropped him near Riverside Park, where tall, bare trees stretched their branches like skeletal hands against a pale sky. He spotted the lion statues, two weathered stone figures flanking an old pathway. They looked proud yet forlorn, silent witnesses to whatever horrors had occurred under the cover of darkness. He tried to imagine Lily and her sister here, huddled in some hidden corner, searching for discarded scraps of bread. The park was mostly empty at this hour, just a few joggers and a mother pushing a stroller along the path. Ethan lingered near the statues, scanning the surroundings. There were benches, a small playground area, and a row of shrubs that might offer cover. If someone had taken Rosie, they could have easily disappeared into the labyrinth of side streets beyond the park. He clenched his fists, feeling helpless. He was a man accustomed to controlling outcomes. This time, no amount of wealth or negotiation could simply fix the problem. He needed others, people like Simon, people like Marjorie, to help him piece together this broken puzzle. As dusk approached, he took a slow walk through the nearest side streets. Many buildings looked run down, with peeling paint and grimy windows. A few people loitered on corners, eyeing him suspiciously as he passed. He thought about asking questions but decided against it. He didn't know who might be involved or who might have ties to the people who had taken Rosie, if indeed that was what happened. Instead, he made mental notes, taking in the shape of the neighborhood, so he could describe it all to Simon. Eventually, he flagged another taxi and headed back toward the community center. He wanted to see Lily, to reassure her that he hadn't run off, that he would stay true to his word. When he arrived, he found Marjorie in the main hall, speaking quietly with a volunteer. She greeted him warmly and led him to the room where Lily had been drawing. Inside, Lily stood at a small table, holding a pencil. She looked up as he entered, her eyes apprehensive. "I'm back," Ethan said softly, keeping his voice low so as not to startle her. Lily nodded, a slight relaxation in her shoulders. He approached the table and saw that she had drawn two figures holding hands, with a smaller figure to the side. It was crude, the lines shaky, but he recognized the shapes of two girls and a grown figure that might have been him. He felt a lump form in his throat. "I spoke to someone who's going to help us," he said, choosing his words carefully. "We think we know where to start looking. It might take some time, but I promise I won't give up." Lily studied his face, as if trying to read his sincerity. She lowered her gaze to the drawing. "Do you really think you can find her?" she asked. Her voice was steady, but he could hear the tremor beneath it. Ethan hesitated only a moment. "Yes," he said, "I do." And he meant it, because giving up now would break something fragile and precious he'd just begun to find again inside himself. He reached out and gently touched the edge of the table. "We'll get through this," he said. "One step at a time." Lily said nothing more. Instead, she placed the drawing in his hand. He looked at it quietly, touched by her silent hope. Whatever it took, he would bring Rosie home. If this small gesture was Lily's way of trusting him, he would not let that trust be in vain. Outside, the light was fading, but in that small, warm room, Ethan felt a spark of determination glow brighter than ever before. Ethan stayed with Lily at the community center until well after dark, determined to reassure her that he was not leaving. Marjorie, ever attentive, brought them hot cocoa and quietly encouraged them to rest. Lily sipped the warm drink from a chipped mug, her fingers gripping the handle so tightly that Ethan feared it might break. He reached out and gently covered her hand with his own, and after a few moments, she loosened her grip and relaxed a fraction. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, and the glow of distant streetlights fell in soft patches across the worn carpeted floor. It was a peaceful space, yet the absence of Rosie was a heavy presence in the room. As the hours passed, Lily began to grow drowsy, her eyes drifting closed between sips. Marjorie found her a cot and several warm blankets. Lily settled in reluctantly, as if afraid that falling asleep might mean losing another day without her sister. Ethan knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. She looked up at him uncertainly, her voice quiet when she spoke. She told him a bit about Rosie, how she loved to hum old lullabies their mother used to sing. She described Rosie's tiny hands and the way she laughed at the simplest jokes. Ethan listened closely, feeling each word land with a weight in his chest. He promised again that he would not stop searching. At that, Lily closed her eyes and finally drifted into a fitful sleep. Ethan stood and joined Marjorie near the front room. He felt strangely at home in this place he had never cared to know before. The quiet hum of a heater, the soft murmur of children in another room, the gentle presence of Marjorie all formed a refuge from the cold indifference outside. He realized just how long it had been since he'd allowed himself to feel this kind of warmth. Marjorie caught his thoughtful look and tilted her head slightly, as if understanding. They didn't speak for a while, each lost in their own thoughts, until the sound of Ethan's phone vibrating in his pocket broke the silence. He stepped into the hall and answered the call. It was Simon, his voice low and tense. Simon said he had managed to talk to a street vendor who remembered seeing two girls and a man lurking around the lion statues. The vendor claimed the younger girl had vanished when the older one left, and that the man had hurried away shortly after. No license plate numbers, no clear description, but at least a confirmation that Rosie had likely been taken. Simon mentioned trying another angle. A local resident who often watched the park from her apartment window. He would knock on doors if necessary. Ethan thanked him, voice tight, and hung up. It was not the breakthrough he hoped for, but it was something. He returned to the dimly lit room where Lily slept and sat quietly in a chair by the wall. He wondered what his younger self would think of him now, a man who had built a fortress of wealth around himself, only to find meaning in something so simple as helping a vulnerable child. He thought back to his own childhood. There had been warmth once, a closeness with his sister that he never dared speak of now. He remembered how protective he felt, how he once held her hand in a crowd, vowing never to let her go. But life had a way of pushing people apart, and he had let bitterness and misunderstandings fill the gaps. The pain of that regret had turned him into a man who rarely looked back. Yet here he was, looking after Lily as if trying to atone for old sins. As morning light began to soften the edges of the room's shadows, Lily woke with a small gasp, her eyes darting around until they landed on Ethan. She seemed relieved to see him still there. He rose and knelt beside her cot, asking if she was hungry. She nodded, and Marjorie appeared in the doorway, smiling softly as if she had anticipated this. Soon Lily had a bowl of oatmeal and a glass of milk, and Ethan watched her eat, every spoonful a reminder that he was responsible for keeping hope alive. When Lily finished, Ethan sat beside her and asked if she remembered anything else about the night Rosie disappeared. Lily thought carefully, then described a car parked across the street with a broken taillight. She recalled that the man might have been wearing a dark coat and a knit hat, and that Rosie had cried out just before she vanished. Ethan squeezed her hand gently. These details could help, he assured her. He would tell Simon everything. Lily nodded, her face resolute in its sadness. Later that day, Ethan arranged to meet Simon near the park, hoping to retrace steps to find some overlooked clue. Before leaving, he asked Lily if she wanted to stay at the center or come with him. She hesitated, then said she wanted to stay. He understood. Perhaps it was too painful to return to that spot, or maybe she simply felt safer here. He promised he would return and kissed the top of her head before stepping outside. Walking through the city, Ethan felt the cold wind on his face and realized how far he had traveled from the man he once was. He had never been cruel, but he had been closed off, self-absorbed, and distant. Now each step was guided by a genuine desire to do right by someone who needed him. It was not a transaction, not a PR move, not a debt to be collected. It felt like the purest thing he had ever done. Simon met him near the lion statues, flipping through notes on a small notepad. He had spoken to the apartment dweller, who claimed to have seen a car speeding away that night, headlights flickering. She mentioned something about a particular warehouse district where suspicious activities often occurred. It was not much to go on, but enough for a lead. Together, they walked the perimeter, checking for security cameras that might have captured something useful. Some were broken, others too far away, but Simon took pictures and would later try to connect with someone who could help retrieve footage. As afternoon shadows stretched across the pavement, Ethan's phone rang. It was Marjorie, her voice gentle but urgent. Lily had found an old letter tucked in the pocket of her coat. It seemed to be from her mother, something that mentioned family Ethan didn't know about. Lily was asking questions, and Marjorie felt Ethan should be there. He thanked her and began heading back. On the return journey, he felt a flutter of anxiety. Lily's mother's letter might hold secrets, pieces of the past that could explain how these girls ended up alone on the street. He tried to remain calm. This was about finding Rosie and keeping Lily safe. Yet the idea of a letter from a mother he never knew made him uneasy. Still, this could be important. Lily's trust depended on him being honest and present. When he reached the community center, Lily was waiting with Marjorie in the main hall. In Lily's hand was a crumpled piece of paper. Ethan approached slowly, heart pounding. Lily looked up, her eyes full of questions. He prepared himself for whatever he might learn, knowing that no matter what truths came to light, he had to remain steady for Lily, for Rosie, and for the man he wanted to become. Ethan approached Lily, noticing how tightly she clutched the worn piece of paper. Her knuckles were white, and her eyes darted anxiously between him and Marjorie. He knelt down to her level, trying to appear calm, though his heart was pounding. He asked if he could see the letter, and Lily hesitated before offering it to him. The paper was creased and slightly stained, its edges ragged, as if it had been handled often before ending up in her coat pocket. He began to read in silence. The handwriting was delicate and looping, undoubtedly a woman's touch. It spoke of struggle, of love, and of regret. It mentioned two little girls, Lily and Rosie, and a desire to keep them safe despite desperate circumstances. As Ethan's eyes moved across the page, his breath caught. The letter was signed by Claire, a name that struck him like a bolt of lightning. Claire was his sister's name, the sister he had lost contact with many years ago. Ethan's hands shook slightly. He read the letter again, slower this time. Claire's words suggested that she had tried to reach out to a family member long ago, wanting to mend old wounds. She mentioned how hard life had been, how she was alone after her husband left, and how she had two daughters who deserved better. She wrote about how she planned to come home, but fear and pride held her back. The letter ended abruptly, as if never finished, just a plea for understanding and forgiveness. He realized with a painful clarity that Lily and Rosie were his nieces, the daughters of his estranged sister. The knowledge sank into him, heavy and profound. He looked at Lily and wondered how to explain this without frightening her. He knew he had to tell her something, so he took a steadying breath and began quietly. "This letter," he said, voice gentle, "was written by someone very close to me. My sister, Claire. She was your mother." Lily's eyes widened, her face a mask of confusion and disbelief. She looked to Marjorie, then back to Ethan. The silence stretched out, thick with questions unasked. Lily finally managed to whisper, "You knew my mother?" Ethan's throat tightened. "I knew her long ago, when we were young. We grew up together, but we lost touch." "I'm sorry, Lily. I didn't know that Claire was your mother until now." Lily's eyes welled with tears, and Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder. He did not push her to speak. Instead, he allowed her to absorb the news at her own pace. He wondered what this meant for both of them. He had vowed to help Lily find Rosie out of compassion, but now he realized he was not merely a stranger trying to set things right. He was family, and these girls were all that remained of the only person who had once known him as a kind boy, not the distant man he had become. Marjorie stepped away to give them privacy, and Ethan guided Lily to a small bench near a window. They sat side by side, watching dust motes float in the shaft of afternoon light. Lily spoke first. "My mom said we had family somewhere," she said softly, "but I never really believed her. I thought maybe she was just dreaming." Ethan looked down at his hands, remembering Claire's laughter, her fierce will, and the way she used to tug at his arm when she wanted him to pay attention to something important. He had let time and misunderstandings separate them, and now this was all that remained. "I wish I had known," he said quietly. "I would have helped her. I would have helped you and Rosie sooner." Lily wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "But you're helping now," she said simply. Ethan nodded, his chest aching with gratitude and regret. He spent the rest of the afternoon speaking gently with Lily, answering her questions as best he could. He told her about Claire when they were children, how kind she was, how she liked to draw pictures in the margins of her notebooks. He avoided the painful parts, not wanting to burden Lily with the weight of old family rifts. Instead, he spoke of love and the possibility that, despite everything, Claire must have tried to do what she thought was best for her daughters. As dusk fell, Ethan stepped outside to update Simon. The investigator had a few leads, mentioning that someone matching the vague description had been seen driving toward a set of abandoned warehouses by the river. It was a dangerous area, he warned, not the kind of place to wander alone. Ethan thanked him and said he would pay whatever it took for Simon to pursue this lead thoroughly. He wanted Rosie found as soon as possible, before darkness could swallow her fate entirely. When he returned inside, Lily was sitting with Marjorie, nibbling on a piece of bread. She looked weary, as if the revelations of the day had taken a toll on her small shoulders. Ethan approached and spoke gently. "I'm going to keep looking, Lily. I promise you. Simon has a new lead. We'll find Rosie." Lily gazed at him, searching his face for any hint of uncertainty. She must have found none, because she nodded, tears shining again in her eyes. "You're my uncle," she said softly, the words awkward on her tongue, as if testing their shape. Ethan's heart twisted. "Yes," he replied. "I am." He knelt beside her again, taking her small hand. "I know I can't make up for lost time," he said, "but I want to be here for you, now and always." Lily rested her head against his arm for a moment, as if needing to feel that he was real and solid in there. He let her stay like that, a quiet reassurance passing between them. That evening, Marjorie offered Lily a bed in a small side room, quiet and comfortable. Before Lily went to sleep, she handed Ethan the letter again. "You keep it," she said. "It's from your sister, too." He accepted it, folding it carefully and placing it in his jacket pocket. He knew he would read it many times, searching for meaning, for absolution, for clues to who Claire had been after all those lost years. Outside, the wind had calmed, and a hush fell over the building. Ethan stood in a hallway, the letter still warming the pocket near his heart. He understood now that this was no longer just a mission to rescue a lost child. It was a chance to reconnect with the past, to heal old wounds, and to rebuild a family from the ashes of old regrets. He would not fail Lily, and he would not fail Rosie. With that resolve guiding him, he prepared to face whatever lay ahead, determined to bring the two sisters home together again. Ethan spent the next morning making calls and arranging resources. He had decided to personally accompany Simon to the warehouse district that afternoon. Normally, he would have hesitated to venture into such places, but now he felt no choice but to engage directly. Before leaving, he spoke quietly with Lily, who looked at him with a mixture of fear and trust. He explained that Simon and he were going to try to learn more about Rosie's whereabouts. He promised he would be careful and that he would come back. Lily only nodded, her face pale, but he could tell she believed him. Marjorie offered to keep Lily busy, perhaps letting her help with small tasks around the center to pass the time. Ethan arrived at the appointed street corner and found Simon leaning against a lamppost, wearing a worn jacket and scanning the area as if he expected trouble from every direction. They set off toward the warehouses, a part of the city that felt removed from the familiar rhythm of daily life. The streets were nearly empty, the buildings looming with shattered windows, rusted metal gates, and faded signs. Ethan's footsteps sounded too loud in his own ears, and he glanced around, wondering what he would do if they found trouble. He realized he was nervous, not just about physical danger, but about failing Lily and losing this fragile chance to set things right. Simon led him to a vacant lot behind a chain-link fence. From there, they had a view of 3 large warehouses. One showed signs of recent activity, a few footprints in the dust, a faint smell of gasoline in the air. Simon pointed out a broken window on the second floor and a door that looked recently forced. He spoke quietly, explaining that someone who matched the vague description Lily had given might have passed through here. Ethan's heart sank at the emptiness of the scene. Without a direct lead, how would they find Rosie? They circled the perimeter carefully, hoping to spot a security camera or a witness, but nothing presented itself. Eventually, they found a side street where a small grocery store stood, its neon sign flickering. Simon suggested they ask inside, hoping the store's owner might have seen or heard something. Inside, a weary-looking man behind the counter eyed them suspiciously at first. But after they described the missing child, and after Ethan pressed a photograph into his hand, one Lily had drawn of Rosie, the man softened. He remembered seeing a young girl who seemed frightened, being led into a van by a man wearing a knit hat. He provided a partial plate number and mentioned that the van seemed to head toward the old docks. This was something concrete. Simon jotted the details in his notebook. With renewed hope, they thanked the man and stepped outside. The docks were not far, just a few blocks closer to the river's edge. Ethan felt a knot in his stomach tighten. The idea of Rosie being taken to such a place, hidden away, made him clench his fists in anger and fear. He imagined her crying for Lily, alone and scared. He forced himself to remain calm. He needed to think clearly. As they approached the docks, the smell of stagnant water and decaying wood filled the air. They walked past rusted cranes and abandoned cargo containers. Eventually, they heard voices echoing from behind a stack of old crates. Simon motioned for Ethan to stay back while he crept closer. Ethan watched as Simon leaned in, listening. After a moment, Simon returned quietly, his face grim. He had overheard a snippet of conversation suggesting that a child had been smuggled through this area recently. There was talk of moving her again soon. It was possible that Rosie was still nearby. Ethan's heart pounded. He and Simon moved further along the pier until they found a door with fresh scratch marks on the lock. Simon tried it, and to their surprise, it opened with a creak. Inside, it was dark and smelled of damp concrete. They stepped carefully, guided by the faint light coming through cracks in the walls. Every step Ethan took echoed in the silence, and he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Suddenly, a figure emerged from behind a stack of crates, raising a flashlight beam that caught Ethan full in the eyes. He raised his hand to shield himself, but Simon quickly stepped forward, flashing his credentials. Though Simon was not a police officer, he had certain connections that could carry weight if he implied cooperation with the authorities. The figure hesitated, uncertain. Ethan took advantage of the pause to ask about Rosie, describing the little girl and the man who might have taken her. The figure glared, refusing to answer at first. Then Simon leaned in, voice low and firm, promising that if he did not help, he would face consequences more serious than he could imagine. The tension was thick, the silence broken only by distant water lapping at the dock's pylons. Finally, the man spat on the ground and mumbled something about a van leaving that morning. He said the child was moved to a different location, somewhere less risky. Ethan felt a wave of despair, but Simon pressed for details. The man shook his head, saying he had heard a name. A deserted building near an old factory, a few miles inland. He claimed he knew nothing else. Simon made a show of writing it all down, then backed away, pulling Ethan along. Once outside, Ethan cursed softly under his breath. They were close, so close, yet always one step behind. Simon put a hand on Ethan's shoulder. There was a look of determination in the detective's eyes. He promised that they would keep following every lead, every whispered rumor, until they found Rosie. Ethan nodded, grateful for Simon's steadiness. He realized that he was not alone in this search, and that gave him strength. They headed back toward the community center, the cold wind at their backs. Ethan felt worn out by the frustration of the day, but he also knew that he could not return empty-handed. Lily was waiting. He remembered her face when she had called him uncle, how vulnerable and hopeful she had looked. He needed to bring her good news. He struggled with what to say. Should he be honest that they had not found Rosie yet? That they were still chasing shadows through abandoned docks and warehouses? The truth was he owed her honesty, but he also owed her hope. By the time he arrived, Lily was pacing the hallway, anxiety etched in every line of her body. When she saw Ethan, she ran forward and looked up at him, searching his face. He knelt down and tried to speak calmly, telling her they had new leads and that they would not stop searching. He explained that Rosie had likely been moved, but they were getting closer. Lily stared at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. She did not cry, but her eyes shone with fierce determination. She thanked him, and in that quiet, trembling voice, she told him she believed in him. Ethan rose, placing a gentle hand on Lily's shoulder. He promised her they would find Rosie. He meant it with everything he had. There, under the warm glow of a single lamp in the corridor, he vowed silently to himself that he would follow every lead, confront every danger, until Rosie was safely back where she belonged. Ethan spent the remainder of the evening working with Simon, going through each scrap of information gathered so far. The old factory district the informant had mentioned was sprawling, full of abandoned mills and machinery rusting under layers of grime. It was a place where people seldom ventured without a reason. There would be no easy way to search it all at once. They would need to be systematic, maybe start with properties known for suspicious activities. Simon began making calls, leaving messages for contacts who might know something about recent movements in that area. Ethan stood by the window, one hand pressed against the cool glass, watching headlights sweep across the street below. He thought of Rosie, picturing her as Lily had described, small, quiet, and easily frightened. He thought of the songs Claire used to sing and wondered if Rosie remembered any of them. The idea of Rosie alone in an unfamiliar place, frightened and maybe hungry, churned his stomach. He focused on Lily's trust. That trust was a fragile gift, and he would not break it. Early the next morning, before Lily woke, Ethan and Simon drove to the outskirts of the city. The landscape changed as they left behind neat rows of apartment buildings and entered a zone of old brick factories, their soot-stained chimneys rising into a pale sky. This was once a manufacturing district, abandoned decades ago. Now it stood silent and forgotten, except for those who chose to operate in secrecy. The roads were cracked and strewn with debris. They passed a few other cars, but most of the streets were empty. They parked a block away from the address Simon had pieced together. The building in question had long ago been a textile mill. Now its windows were boarded up, and a chain hung loosely on the front door, the lock broken. They approached carefully, walking in silence. Outside, nothing stirred but a few scraps of old newspaper caught in a light breeze. Inside, it was dim and musty. Dust motes floated in the beams of faint light that seeped through cracks in the boards. They moved quietly, checking one room after another, but found nothing more than old machines and piles of rotting fabric. In a back corner, they discovered a makeshift bedroll and some canned food. Someone had been here recently, perhaps even slept here. Ethan felt a surge of both hope and dread. If Rosie had been here, then they were on the right track. But she was gone now, and they needed to know where. Simon crouched down, examining footprints in the dust. He guessed that whoever was here might have left in a hurry. They found a window that opened onto an alley behind the building. Perhaps this was how Rosie's captor moved her around, slipping from one hiding place to another. Leaving the factory, they searched the alley until they found a neighbor willing to talk. She was an older woman, suspicious at first, but when she realized they were searching for a missing girl, she softened. She remembered hearing a child's cry late last night, something that had unnerved her. She glanced out her window just in time to see a van pulling away, heading further north. She couldn't give a description beyond that, but every clue mattered. As they returned to the car, Ethan's phone rang. It was Marjorie, her voice urgent but steady. Lily had received a message. It wasn't written down. It had come through a neighbor boy at the community center who sometimes wandered the streets. He claimed that someone had slipped him a note to give to Lily, and this note mentioned Rosie by name. Marjorie said Lily was frightened, but trying to be brave. Ethan promised to return immediately. He asked Simon to keep searching and call him with any new information. Simon understood, driving Ethan back toward the city center in tense silence. When Ethan arrived, he found Lily sitting in a quiet room off the main hall. She held a small piece of grimy paper, folded into a triangle. He knelt beside her, asking softly if he could see it. She handed it over, her hand trembling. The note was scrawled in rough handwriting, the letters uneven. It said that if anyone wanted Rosie back unharmed, they should leave money at a certain street corner by midnight. There were no instructions on how much, just an implication that they knew Lily had found someone with resources. No name was given, just the threat. Ethan clenched his teeth, fury and fear mingling in his chest. Lily's eyes were wide, struggling to hold back tears. Ethan put a hand on her shoulder, trying to project calm. He told her this was actually good news. Now they knew someone wanted to bargain. That meant Rosie was still alive, still valuable to these people. He promised Lily he would handle this carefully. He said he would speak to Simon and the authorities he trusted. Lily watched him, uncertain. She asked him a simple question. What if it's a trap? Ethan looked into her eyes and admitted it might be. But he had to try, and he would not leave Rosie at their mercy. He made calls to Simon and to a contact he knew in the police department, someone discreet who wouldn't turn this into a public spectacle but could provide backup if necessary. As the hours ticked by, Ethan prepared himself for a confrontation. He arranged for money, enough to show he was serious, and planned to meet at the designated street corner well before midnight. He would not go alone. Simon agreed to watch from a distance, and Ethan managed to convince one trusted officer to stake out the area incognito. Before leaving, he sat with Lily and Marjorie once more. He explained the plan in careful terms, not wanting to frighten Lily more than she already was. Lily asked if she could give something to Rosie when she returned. Without waiting for an answer, Lily took a small cloth doll from a shelf. It was old and patched, one eye missing, but clearly loved. She pressed it into Ethan's hands, instructing him to give it to Rosie. Ethan nodded, feeling the lump in his throat. This simple doll represented all Lily's hope and love. As midnight approached, Ethan and Simon made their way to the chosen spot. It was a deserted intersection near an old train yard, the moon high overhead. The night was still, every sound magnified. Ethan carried a small bag containing the money and Lily's doll tucked inside. He waited, heart pounding. If Rosie's captors showed, he would pay whatever was needed to get her back. If they tried something worse, he and Simon would be ready. He thought of Lily waiting back at the center, her faith in him unshaken despite all the setbacks. He thought of Claire's letter, of regrets and second chances. He stood there, body tense, determined that this time, he would not fail his family again. The wind picked up slightly, rustling trash in the gutter. Headlights flickered at the end of the block. Ethan took a deep breath, preparing himself. Rosie was out there. He would do whatever it took to bring her home safe and sound. Ethan stood beneath a dim street lamp with Simon hidden nearby, a stillness settling over the deserted corner. He could feel his heart pounding against his ribs as he gripped the small bag containing the money and Lily's doll. He told himself again and again that he would not fail, that he would bring Rosie home. The minutes dragged, each second stretching until it felt like an hour. Every distant sound made him lift his head, scanning the dark streets and abandoned buildings that loomed like silent witnesses. Just when he began to think no one would come, a pair of headlights flickered around the corner. A van approached slowly, its engine humming quietly. It stopped a short distance away, and two figures stepped out. One wore a knit hat, the other a bulky jacket. Both kept their faces partly hidden. Ethan forced himself to stay calm, to keep his voice steady as they approached. The man in the knit hat spoke first, asking if Ethan had the money. Ethan said he did, but he wanted proof that Rosie was alive and safe. The man chuckled low, then pulled out a phone and played a muffled recording. A child's voice whimpered, calling out for Lily. Ethan's stomach twisted at the sound, both relief and agony washing over him. He demanded to see her in person. The kidnappers exchanged a glance, then told him Rosie was in a nearby building, safe for now. He could have the girl once they had the money. Ethan said he would not hand over anything until he knew Rosie was unharmed. They argued in hushed voices, tension crackling in the air. The night around them felt poised on a knife's edge. From his concealed position, Simon watched closely. He had an officer stationed in a parked car down the block, ready to move in if things went badly. The kidnappers, suspicious, insisted Ethan walk with them. If he tried anything, they warned, Rosie would pay the price. Ethan's hands shook slightly. He had to play this carefully. He held the bag up, showing its contents to prove he was serious. Slowly, he followed the kidnappers down a side alley, past a line of old shipping crates stacked against a warehouse wall. They stopped near a dented metal door. The bulky jacketed figure pulled out a key and fumbled with the lock. Ethan's heart raced, wondering if Rosie was just beyond that door, huddled in the dark. He clenched his jaw, thinking of Lily waiting anxiously, trusting him to bring her sister back. He could not lose control now. The door creaked open. Inside, the air was stale and smelled of old chemicals. The kidnappers gestured for Ethan to step in. He refused, demanding to see Rosie. With a frustrated growl, the knit hat man flicked on a weak flashlight, illuminating a small interior room. At first, Ethan saw only crates and broken furniture. Then he heard it, a soft sob, muffled by what sounded like cloth. He moved closer, one cautious step at a time. In the beam of the flashlight, he glimpsed a small figure curled behind a stack of boxes, bound and gagged. Rosie. Ethan's breath caught. There she was, trembling and frightened, her eyes huge with terror. He reached into the bag and pulled out Lily's doll, holding it up so Rosie could see it. He whispered her name, telling her he was here to help, that Lily had sent him. Rosie's eyes flickered with recognition at the sight of the doll. She made a small sound, a hopeful whimper. The kidnappers grew impatient. They ordered Ethan to put down the money. He knelt and set it on a low crate, but as he stood, the door behind them creaked again. The kidnappers whirled around, startled by a figure entering silently. It was Simon, slipping in to ensure there would be no double cross. The intruders cursed, pulling out a metal bar. Before Ethan could react, one of them swung it in his direction. He ducked, heart pounding. Simon lunged, trying to grab the man's arm. The small room erupted into chaos. One kidnapper tried to snatch the money and run, but Simon blocked him. The other lunged at Ethan, snarling. Ethan braced himself, stepping sideways and managing to push the attacker off balance. The commotion frightened Rosie, who cried out, her voice muffled. Ethan forced himself to stay focused. He had to get Rosie out of here. He shouted for Simon to hold them off. Simon grunted a reply, struggling to keep the kidnappers from fleeing. In that moment, the backup officer rushed in, drawn by the noise. With a flashlight and a drawn weapon, the officer demanded everyone freeze. The kidnappers, outnumbered and cornered, cursed again and dropped their makeshift weapons. In the confusion, Ethan rushed to Rosie's side. He gently removed the gag and untied her bonds, speaking softly. He told her it was over, that she was safe now. Rosie stared at him, tears on her cheeks, clinging to him as he lifted her into his arms. The officer secured the kidnappers, radioing for reinforcements. Simon straightened, breathing hard, checking that Ethan and Rosie were unharmed. Ethan nodded, relief flooding through him. He felt Rosie's tiny hands grip his jacket as if afraid he might vanish. He whispered that Lily was waiting, that her sister had never given up hope. Rosie's sobs slowed, and she rested her head against his shoulder. They stepped outside into the cool night air. Sirens wailed in the distance, and headlights swept the alley as more help arrived. Ethan cradled Rosie, who held the doll close to her chest. He murmured words of comfort, telling her she would be home soon, safe with Lily. Rosie did not speak much, only nodded and sniffled, as if too overwhelmed to form words. Simon gave Ethan a nod of respect, relieved that this nightmare had ended without further harm. Ethan thanked him quietly, knowing he could not have done this alone. He had found family he never knew he had, and he had saved a life that might have been lost. He carried Rosie down the alley, away from the broken door and the dark rooms, toward a waiting car. Soon, he would take her to Lily. Soon, they would be together again. A better future waited for them all now that the past had found its way forward into a healing light. After hearing this story of reunion, take a moment. What connections do you need to rekindle in your own life? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to check out the upcoming videos on the channel.